Hello everyone, today I'm going to be reviewing the new Neurosis record, Honour Found in Decay. Now, before I get stuck into this review, I just want to point out that prior to this release, I've never listened to Neurosis. I know they're a post-metal-sludge band that have influenced a lot within this genre, and they're sort of underground metal heroes, and have been around since the mid-80s. But I wanted to hear this out without hearing any of their previous releases, so I could really focus on the music, and just what I thought of it. So anyway, Honour Found in Decay. The album opens up with the track We All Rage in Gold, which opens with a very bright, in-your-face feedback coming from a guitar amp, and the guitar plays a very standard chord progression, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, with no foreshadowing whatsoever, it just kicks straight into it. And I must admit, it all sounds very big and very heavy and crushing in a sense, but it just sounded a touch flat to me. The drums were a little bit too loud in the mix, perhaps. I didn't really like the guys' cymbals and things like that, the way they sounded. And I just felt like it didn't have that much impact, so there wasn't really much of a build into it. It was just kind of all of a sudden whack. However, having said that, as it progresses, there are some interesting sounds buried in the mix, and it eventually sort of simmers down, and there are these kind of eerie synthesizers sweeping in and out, or at least I think they're synthesizers, but for the most part it's just that same guitar riff. Eventually it sort of boils down to nothing but clean guitar, and then it's built upon with strings, but to me the strings just sounded a little bit cheap, if they were strings, and then it all kicks in again. Here I kind of feel the drumming is decent and keeping it mixed, but ultimately it just doesn't sound that impressive, fails to create any sort of atmosphere or really engage me in any way, and it just kind of drags on a bit too long without enough interesting stuff happening to keep me hooked or keep me wanting more. The next track, At the Well, once again opens with guitar chords being strummed with singing over the top. There's a sudden drum hit, again no real build to it. And I must admit, this time once it kicks in, there's no real interesting layers. There's some feedback in the mix which sounds pretty cool, but other than that, it's not changing anywhere near enough to justify its length. However, around midway, there's some nice instrumentation with some horns, but again, it sort of simmers down, these horns are played, kicks in again, and it just doesn't really function a great deal beyond getting loud and then quiet again. And I must admit, this is an issue I'm having with the whole record. It just sort of, a lot of the times, just gets loud, quiets down, gets loud again, quiets down again, then might get loud again at the end, and that's pretty much it. At around the 7-minute mark, it sort of speeds up a bit, and I must admit, it actually sounds fairly decent. It's nice and thick, nice and sludgy, and it begins getting even more loud, picking up more momentum as it goes, but then the vocals kick in, and it just sort of lost all the extra instrumentation, which sadly kind of killed the whole vibe of the thing, and I felt that all I had left was some noisy distorted guitar and a bass, which wouldn't normally be a bad thing, but hearing that pretty much all the way through the song so far does get a bit dull. Ultimately, I don't really think there's a great deal more I can say about this album. It just fails to really create any atmosphere or any sense of crushing heaviness, because the production just isn't there for the most part either. A problem I had with the next track, My Heart for Deliverance, is another problem I had with a lot of the album. I feel the introduction was trying to be nice and atmospheric and dark, and I sort of got that from the guitar. It was quite nice and sounded good. But then, again, there's this weird effect that comes in, this weird sort of bassy, distorted wobble, and I just felt it sounded a little bit silly and kind of killed the vibe. And as more added effects get piled on top, it just sort of drowns out the initial guitar, and I felt like it was a bit too swamped and then just got loud again. The mid-section on this track, where it simmers down again after this initial climax, I actually quite liked. There's some nice guitar, and the piano sounds nice underneath it too. A vocal sample comes in talking about Earth and the stars, and it sounds pretty decent, but then it kicks in again. And I must admit, this climax is actually the first one I'm really enjoying. It sounded quite big, quite thick, and almost epic in a sense. But then again, it just sort of dragged on a bit too much, didn't do enough to keep me interested, and this song just can't justify its 11-minute length. Some other moments, like the start of this track, that I felt sort of killed what was initially being made was the next song, Bleeding the Pigs, which opens with some very dark sound effects, and then a guitar comes in that just sounds a little bit too loud and too sharp on top of it. And again, it just kills the vibe. Now on this track, something I noticed when the vocals came in is the almost ridiculous lyrics. The serpent swallows its tail. Later on in the track, there's the line, "Scrape the black tar from your past life." As this album progresses through the next couple of songs, it just doesn't do anything particularly new or interesting. It's the same as what you've heard before, with some perhaps slightly different effects, slightly different instrumentation perhaps, but nothing so drastically different it's really gonna make you enjoy this if you didn't already enjoy the beginning. On the whole, I feel this album was just a little bit too monotone and same pace as well, and I must admit, there was an absolute crashing ending. The song's called Raise the Dawn, and it starts quiet and begins to build. It's actually a fairly nice build in fairness for once, but I'd really lost all interest by this point. And it sort of gets really loud really quickly, but then it just stays loud for 5 minutes. How loud it is kind of varies a little bit throughout the track, but it doesn't change. It's got the least effects and least interesting sounds out of all the tracks on the album, and it ended on some kind of nice fading guitars, but again, at this point I just really lost interest completely. I feel like this album really didn't function beyond being really quiet and then getting loud again. And normally I wouldn't care, but it was just so monotonous in the way it did it that I got really bored by the end. It's an hour long and it really cannot justify that length in any way whatsoever. I just feel like it dragged with many repeated ideas that I've heard before from other bands. The production was pretty poor. Like I said, the drums were too loud in the mix for the most part, and I felt whenever it created an atmosphere, it was killed or completely drowned out by a bunch of effects around it. I did feel like at points it had some nice, interesting sounds. There were some moments where it created these almost quite vast, quieter soundscapes, but again, too much instrumentation at points, just too many effects, too many weird sounds in the background that really killed the vibe for me. And ultimately, to be honest, this record just did nothing to interest, excite, or even temporarily really entertain me. For all the reasons above, I'm going to give this record a 3 out of 10. Now, on another note, I know Neurosis are supposed to be a really, really great band and to have released some great records, and this record hasn't put me off checking them out, because if you had this album on paper, or at least what it was trying to achieve on paper, an atmospheric, sludgy, heavy record with some interesting instrumentations, I would be all ears. So I'll definitely check out their other stuff. It'd be great if you could post some albums for me to check out, I'd love that. But that's pretty much the end of this review. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment and subscribe. Also, I'd love to hear what you thought of this record. Cheers for watching and I'll catch you all later.